I'm a clinician, I'm an investigator at Mid-Atlantic. We're a research-driven clinical epilepsy center, and we run about 24 pharma and investigator-led projects as well as nationally funded projects, covering many aspects of epilepsy treatment and prevention. This talk is about clinical drug trials in epilepsy, treatment access, and new medication development. So clinical trials, what are they? How do they help patients? What's their role in clinical management? What does it look like to participate in a trial? So this is a bird's eye view. Just to begin with, I wanted to show you sort of the framework of how we treat seizures and where trials fits in. So as many of you know, after diagnosis of epilepsy, most patients will require a daily medication that will help to increase the seizure threshold. The first-line therapies are chosen depending on your EEG results, your test results, the type of seizures you have, weighing possible side effects, looking at the entire patient. You're all familiar with this process, and you know that it's done in conjunction with your epilepsy specialist so that they can choose the most appropriate medication for your situation. Now, many patients will respond to the first oral seizure medication, but about half of patients, which is a large number, will continue to have seizures on the first medication, and then they will require a second medication to be either added on or substituted. And unfortunately, over time, about a third of epilepsy patients, again large numbers, will not respond or be termed refractory or resistant to the available medications. And at this point, the treatment options shift to away from oral medications to other mechanisms such as resective surgery, drug trials, which is where we fit in today, or neurostimulation such as vagal nerve stimulator, TMS, repetitive nerve stimulation, or dietary means such as ketogenic diet. So in this talk, we're going to talk about clinical drug trials, which fits in here. So this is busy, do not distress. I want to focus on why we need clinical drug trials. As we just said, about half of epilepsy patients will not respond to their initial medication. About a third will then need another medication or be refractory to oral medications, rather. And so these next two slides are going to explain why clinical drug trials are needed in epilepsy. So on this slide, it shows a number of different interactions between chemical pathways that can cause seizures. It's complicated again, but the main point I want to show you is that there's a number of places where drugs can work, or different mechanisms of action, as we call it. And so, for example, we have levetiracetam, which is here, ethosuximide, benzodiazepines, and gabapentin over there. So all different kinds of mechanisms are used to treat epilepsy. And for difficult-to-treat situations, we try to use seizure medications that work at different areas to combat the seizures from different places. Now, based on this concept of using medications with different ways of working, or different mechanisms of action, many new anti-seizure medications have been introduced, especially recently. This is a chart that starts all the way back in 1850, where we were lucky enough to have just one, bromide. Then in the 1910s, 20s, there was phenobarbital. These were discovered sort of like by luck. Okay, it wasn't through trials. It was just it was found to be helpful. Then in the 20s and 30s, the sort of discovery of doing things in mouse models of seizures came into play, and then there was the first development of first-generation medications, which takes us up to ethosuximide. And currently, we are in the third burst or generation of medication development up here. This is fairly up to date from 2021 from Pavel Klein's paper. And we have had more than 10 anti-seizure medications in the past decade, including 4 new seizure medications for Lennox-Gastaut, 3 for Dravet syndrome, and several for tuberous sclerosis, and 1 disease-modifying agent for tuberous sclerosis. So, in general, these new medications have new mechanisms of action that are more specific and more potent, with less side effects affecting things like being sleepy or other unwanted side effects. So they really try to hone in on the mechanism that is causing seizures. And that's great, but in spite of all the new medication development and over 30 seizure medications in total, a third of patients still have uncontrolled epilepsy. And so what this tells us is that we do need better medications. So the question is, how do new medications become available to families? This brings us to the world of clinical research, which is a brand of, clinical trials, which is a brand of medical research that helps find solutions to problems such as epilepsy or seizures. So that's when drugs that work well in a laboratory setting go through rigorous human-based trials to become available to families. And I want to just pause and emphasize that clinical trials are performed for patients to gain access to new medications that can provide better seizure control with less side effects. So better seizure control, less side effects. The clinical drug trials try to address questions such as, does this new drug work? Does it work better than the existing medications? Are there side effects? What should the dosage be? Are there additional health benefits to the medication? Is it going to help my quality of life? Will I be able to drive again? Does it support development? Does it help with behavior? These are all very relevant questions for the community. So, on the next two slides, I'm going to show you the various stages that a potential drug has to go through before it becomes available. So, new medications and all the medications that you know must go through rigorous testing in humans before the FDA will approve it for use. So, clinical trials involve 4 phases, and each phase helps scientists learn something a little bit different about how the drug works in patients. So, first, a drug that works well in experimental models in the lab will be used in small phase 1 studies to look at safety. So that's the first thing. If that goes well, the drug progresses to the next stage, which is called phase 2, in which safety and dosing, what is the proper dose that we should use, is explored in a larger number of people. If that goes well as well, then you move into phase 3, where they look at safety again and efficacy, which is like the effectiveness, so how well the medication works. And this is studied in yet larger numbers of people and compared, importantly, against a control to see which is best, and we'll talk a bit more on controls in a bit. If the drug then works and is safe through all of this, the maker or the company or the sponsor, as we call it, will then submit the drug for FDA review, which usually occurs about 10 months, although I've heard sometimes longer. And finally, the FDA approval allows the drug to be on the market, it's available to families, and then you get to phase 4 studies, which are after approval, which are long-term surveillance studies showing long-term side effects on real patients using the drug in the real world. So at every stage, safety is of the utmost importance. And this is another side where I wanted to show you again. Phase 1 is looking at healthy individuals, looking at safety primarily. Phase 2 is larger groups, looking at safety and side effects. And phase 3, importantly, compares the new drug with standard or control treatments that already exist. So at this point, I wanted to explain the process of comparing the new drug to other medications. So when you hear about clinical trials, you often hear the word randomization, which is something that occurs here in phase 3, and refers to a process when a participant is assigned at random, via some computer program, to receive either the new treatment or the control. So randomization is important because it shows if the new treatment is safer and works better than what we already have or being on nothing at all. Now, this is a picture of randomization showing that we have 2 groups. So we start with all the patients who are in the study. They're randomly assigned to either the treatment group or the control group. And at this point, how do we keep the people who are in the treatment group from saying, aha, I'm on a new drug and I feel better, or having a bias that they're doing better because they're on a treatment? So at this point, many trials will use something called double blinding, which is when participants and the study team do not know if the participant is receiving a treatment or a control. And this is how we prevent that bias of information that I'm on a new drug, I feel better kind of thing. And so that way we make sure that the information is most accurate. As we saw before, safety is mentioned in all the phases. It's paramount. And even after FDA approval, it is still being monitored long-term in the real world. But returning to clinical trials for epilepsy, we know that seizures are not all the same, okay? Treatments are also not all the same. So your neighbor with childhood onset seizures is very different to the neighbor with a genetic syndrome that involves many organ systems, is very different to the adult who's developing seizures because of a tumor. So each of these people with epilepsy have very different seizures and will need very different treatments. So it makes sense that clinical drug trials look at whether a particular drug works for particular seizure types or particular epilepsy syndromes. And by those, I mean epilepsy seizure types, focal onset partial seizures. You also have generalized onset seizures, and you have other types of categories like prolonged seizures or status epilepticus. And examples of epilepsy syndromes include tuberous sclerosis, Lennox-Gastaut, Dravet syndrome. And these are all conditions, and there are many, many more for which there are clinical drug trials to see how a drug can affect seizures. And I'm happy to talk about specific trials afterwards if anyone has any questions. But I want to move on to who can be in a trial. So clinical trial participants are adults and children with epilepsy and even healthy volunteers. So anyone can really help out in some sense. If you think about it, in the phase 1 studies where safety is being looked at, they do need healthy volunteers just to study how the medication transitions from the laboratory setting to the human setting. And since diseases and drugs affect children and adults differently, we also need to have clinical trials that show that the new treatment works for children as well as adults. So for in those situations, trials will occur in the adult populations first and then be transitioned into children, usually grouped by ages or by weight and studied that way. There are also trials for conditions that occur in childhood only. So what happens then in a clinical trial? So for this example, I'm going to talk about a typical phase 2-3 trial, which is kind of right before the FDA approval stage. And participants are usually patients with drug-resistant epilepsy who may be taking anywhere between 1 and 3, possibly 4 seizure medications, and typically with no recent changes in their dose for about 1 month before enrollment. The first step that we have is a screening. So the team has to look at if your seizures, your seizure type, seizure frequency, the number of medications you're on, if all of these kind of details fit into the particular trial's criteria. And there are many different trials and many different criteria, but they will review and see which one fits best for you. The study team will also review risks and benefits with you and answer all of your questions. If everybody is agreeable, then there will be a process called informed consent, which is not a contract. It is simply something that says that you agree to go forward, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So the first period is called the baseline period. It's a 4 to 8 week duration when the seizure frequency is recorded, and they'll teach you exactly how to do that. And regular anti-seizure medications that you're already on will again stay the same. And this way we know on the regimen that you're already on how frequent are the seizures before and after the study drug is added. After those 4 weeks of recording the baseline, participants are then randomized to either the control or the new drug. And in many trials, both the patients and the study team will be blinded. It's called double blinding. So subsequently, as with many seizure medications, we need to titrate up on the dose. We usually start low and go slow while monitoring for side effects. So this would occur over 2 to 6 weeks. And then you would get to your goal dose, which is depending on your weight and age and so forth. And that would be kept for anywhere between 6 to 14 weeks. And then finally, there's a down titration lasting 2 to 4 weeks. So you're sort of slowly going up, maintaining a period, and then coming down, all the while recording your seizure frequency and whatever else they're trying to study in that trial. Finally, as in many drugs, there will be something like an open label extension or open access, which is a subsequent stage where there's a choice for participants to continue on the study drug. And this is a time before the FDA has approved it, so it would be the only way you could sort of access the drug in that situation. And at that stage, you can adjust your regular medications as well as the study drug.
That's in the
open label, yes. And so the vital aspects I wanted to just touch on a little bit more, which we mentioned, would be that Informed consent. So informed consent, again, it tells you what are the risks and benefits, what will happen, what are the challenges that may arise. And if it's a study that involves a minor who is able to give assent, then assent is what's obtained from minors, which is their permission to be a volunteer in the trial. Randomization, again, another important aspect, is when the participants are assigned at random to the new treatment or a control. The control can be either a placebo, kind of like a dummy pill, or the known standard treatment, and that depends on sort of the ethics of the situation. And then randomization will show then if the treatment is truly helpful compared to having the regular treatment that's available or no treatment. Again, double blinding, just want to emphasize that patients in the study team oftentimes will not know if the participant is getting treatment or not, and that's to prevent the I'm on a new medication, I feel better bias. And just a word on the open label extension. So that's when the trial ends, and all the eligible participants who are interested, whether or not they were randomly assigned to placebo or treatment, may then continue on the new drug, and doses of all medications may be adjusted based on the effectiveness of the medication. So not all trials will have the open label extension, but in some cases it can provide this free access to the new drug until the FDA approves it. So what's involved in clinical trial participation? So the first thing is obviously time. Each trial has a different duration from the screening to the end. The open label extension duration also depends on the study. There will be a number of in-person visits as well as online and telephone visits. The trend recently has been to make more online availability, but sometimes there need to be things that are measured in person, obviously. And you'll also have to enter either through a paper diary or an electronic diary information about the seizures that are ongoing so that we can find out how well the drug is working. Obviously, there's travel, there's the screening visit, the randomization visit, and some other clinic visits as well with a follow-up visit at the end. And throughout the trial, we do have to remain on a consistent dose for the other baseline medications so that we're not changing too many things at once and getting confused. So participation is voluntary, and researchers and companies know that this is a great amount of sacrifice and work from families. So there is compensation, generally speaking, for families in terms of travel and possibly hotels, gas, and so forth. And sometimes there's a stipend as well. So if you have concerns about participating, I would encourage you to talk to your research coordinator, who probably has solutions in mind already for any potential issues that may arise. Now, going back again, safety being paramount, I just want to reiterate one more time, because trials do exist to make sure that we can find out how safe a drug is. So safety monitoring is important because clinical trials tell us how to use medications, what dose, what method, and what to expect in terms of side effects or adverse events, as they are sometimes referred to. So these can include patient-reported side effects, like I'm tired, I'm dizzy, or they can also include laboratory abnormalities or other things that they check when they have your visits. In many cases, you'll be monitored weekly or thereabouts by the study team for any issues or problems, even if they don't seem to be related to the drug treatment. So just want you to think about for a second, when was the last time your doctor started you on medication and checked on you every week?
Does that mean like a blood test?
No. This can be virtual. It's different for every trial. Some trials do study particularly drug levels, and so they may be a bit more onerous in terms of the blood draws because they're trying to study, like, what dose leads to what level, and then they're trying to correlate those things. But a lot of these other trials will have these kind of visits as a telephone call or something through like an iPad type thing that they will give you. Yeah, so it's variable. I've seen studies with, just very few visits, and then there's also studies with like umpteen visits, and it just really depends. Yeah. But during the study team and the participants will work together to address any issues. Like, for example, I had a patient who had an accident And so, the sponsor will want to know all of that, even if it seems unrelated. And they will decide at the end of the day, was it relevant at all to the fact that they were in the trial? So they want to capture all the information and not just make any assumption. So just know that there's teams of people, including your study team and your physicians, who are, and way more people behind the scenes, who are very invested in making sure that any change or potential side effect is captured, acted upon, even if it means that you have to leave the trial. So it's hard to talk about safety without talking about risk. So the risks of being in a trial include being randomized to the control group. Nobody will know. Under extreme circumstances only will anyone be unblinded. So when you enter a trial, you cannot 100% count on being on the drug. A lot of times the trials will be randomized, half on trial, half on drug. Sometimes it's 1/3 on placebo and 2/3 on drug. Maybe there's different doses involved, things like that. So, but you can't count on being on the drug 100% if it's a randomized trial. There are some trials that are pharmacokinetic trials, which study like the blood levels and the doses, and in those studies, everybody is on the drug. The risk also includes possibility of side effects, including things that we know of and things that we don't know of. And again, that's because we're doing trials to understand safety. Or perhaps the new drug isn't effective, and there's what we call a lack of efficacy. These are all potential risks. But nonetheless, on the flip side, there's many benefits to being in a clinical trial. Clinical trials allow patients to play a more active role in their epilepsy care, to go beyond what limited treatments there are available, to use all possible avenues and options to treat your seizures. And of course, it helps doctors and the community learn more about epilepsy and new treatments. Even if a drug trial is not successful, as in the drug does not get all the way to FDA approval, that information is still used for scientists and doctors to develop the next step of medications and advances. So, Rome was not built in a day. And clinical trials help the epilepsy community. They pave the way for new drugs to become available. They also provide very close medical monitoring. So like I said, when you're on your drug and you're being monitored every week or so, this is essentially free care. And for some of our families, this can be a lifeline. You're getting access to care very often, and some patients really value that. Clinical trials also a type of community service. So if you're a teenager in school, you can get all your service hours by being in a trial, for example. And of course, the open label extension is also a really nice benefit, because even if you're randomized to something, the placebo, you will still have access to the med at the end if there is this kind of extension. So now that you're interested in clinical trials, how can you learn more? You can talk to your neurologist to see what's best for your condition. There's a number of trials that are out there. You can also use your online resources that I've listed here. There's clinicaltrials.gov is the NIH-run site that shows you all of the trials that are in the U.S. and participating centers and everything like that. And Epilepsy Foundation and Epilepsy Syndrome Foundation websites and support groups are also a very good place to start. And attending conferences like here would also be very useful. I see someone taking a picture, so I won't change the slide. But just in closing, I hope it's laid some groundwork for you to understand where trials fit in and what it might do for you and what they do for the community, and what it looks like to be in a trial. So I want to give a big thank you to the epilepsy community and the volunteers who have made and continue to create access to new medications for people with epilepsy. And thanks to the organizers and for your attention. And we might have some time for questions.
Up your flyer and started several that I'm interested in.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, so we have our number on the front,
Okay.
But I can connect with you afterwards too. because maybe based on your diagnosis and your syndrome and so forth, can kind of hone in on some of them.
Okay.
Have the criteria kind of in my mind. So,
Okay.
yeah. Anyone else? Okay, crystal clear. Done. Yeah.
Are they generally looking for patients that are not seizure-free?
No, actually, I should. So, in my previous slide, I was using phase 2, 3. I was talking mostly, just for example sake, I was talking about phase 2 and 3 clinical drug trials, which usually does involve people who have refractory seizures, who are on like between 1 and 4 medications. But there are a lot of studies that are looking for anybody with epilepsy, sometimes if they don't mind what type. And so, for example, am I allowed to talk about specific trials or no? I won't mention any names. There are rescue medications, so you guys know about like rectal diazepam and nasal diazepam and nasal, anyway, midazolam. So for those kind of studies, just sometimes they can look at anybody, and they are less stringent on those criteria. So I would say, I would say just keep your mind open, because if you don't necessarily fit into the very strict category of one trial, if you're at a trial center, you could possibly, go to another one. I mean, we have patients, sadly, all the time, they want this trial, but maybe they're on too many medications to be on that trial, or they're not having quite enough seizures. I had a patient who had like just very close to having enough of the baseline seizure type. And so in that case, you can look at another trial, in that area. And the trials, they come and go all the time, because things are moving through. As soon as they have the 270 people they need, then, they move on. So there's always new things coming and going. So it's an issue you can also revisit, like in another half year or year or so. Yeah. So, but I can also talk to you more in detail about specific stuff. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have a table outside, so if anybody wants to grab flyers or anything about trials in general, it's out there.